Hey, how's it going, everybody? Welcome to the stream. If you're new here, thank you so much for joining in. Today we have a special guest. We're doing things a little bit different. We have Jeff from Craft Computing. Thank you so much. Oh, yes.
Sorry. I didn't realize we were live yet.
Right. But yeah, so we have Jeff from Craft Computing. You guys know him. Homelab extraordinaire, self-hoster extraordinaire. Craft brewing extraordinaire, craft beer aficionado, all the things.
All around, well-rounded dude.
That's right. So yeah, thank you so much for being here, Jeff. We're going to chat about all kinds of stuff, about home labs, about self-hosting, about networking. I have so many questions. But before
Isn't that what you're here for, though?
That's right.
Aren't you here to answer the questions?
Usually. Yeah, usually. We have a pretty big Discord too. If you're not in there, I would love for you to be there. It's a Discord. We have about 7,000 people. We just recently got partnered too, so that's pretty awesome.
Nice.
So absolutely, folks, if you haven't joined, please join. Yeah, so Jeff, man, so for those that don't know you, I know that everyone here knows who you are, but for those that don't know you, how would you describe, I guess, you or your channel?
Me. I'm Jeff. I run Craft Computing over on YouTube. I've also got a Twitter, and that's pretty much it. You can also catch me on Floatplane. Who am I? I am a longtime IT veteran. I spent about 13 years in systems administration and network direction, network administration, all that kind of stuff. Spent pretty much 8 years of that as essentially a technology director for various organizations. Did a lot of state work, did a lot of MSP style work for a lot of small and medium businesses. And so that's where a lot of my skill set comes from, is basically from home lab up to, 100 to 1,000 employees is kind of the wheelhouse that I operate in. Not necessarily big data center or anything like that, but most businesses that are around the country is kind of where I fall into. On the YouTube channel, you can catch me doing everything from home lab stuff. Proxmox and TrueNAS are kind of my bread and butter when it comes to that kind of stuff, to GPU virtualization, to your regular tech tuber, consumer electronics, I'm working on a 12600K gaming PC build right now. I've done 3D printing stuff. I've done pretty much all over the map. So
Yeah, and that's how I found your channel. So I mean, people may or may not notice this, but when I first got started in YouTube, I messaged you. I don't know if you remember this, but it was a long time ago, and I was like, hey, I'm thinking about virtualizing TrueNAS. Will that even work? Because I Googled a ton of stuff, and there wasn't a lot of information on it at the time. And I remember you were just like, yep, should work. Either pass through the HBA or pass through the individual disks. I'm like, let's do this. And so I'm forever grateful for that, because I was like, man, this guy's big time. There's no way he's going to respond.
I think that's one thing that's been really successful for me is I'll follow this up with a really quick anecdote, and that's I'm just a guy. I'm literally just a guy who, like I said, was an IT professional for a number of years, and now I get to do YouTube as a full-time job. But all of you are just people too. Like there's, we all get up and get dressed and have day jobs and everything else, and DMing someone on Twitter should be an interaction between a person, not a faceless, nameless YouTuber. And you weren't talking to my intern or anything when you DM'd me. It was just me. And so I always try to give people the fair time of day. What I will say is I had a very quick acceleration on YouTube. I started my channel in July of 2017, attended my first CES on the heels of someone else in January 2018. And the very first YouTuber that I ran into, when I say ran into, I literally ran into him, was Linus.
Nice.
It's a Monday morning meeting. It's 7 a.m. in Vegas. So usually everyone gets in either Saturday or Sunday. We flew in on Sunday. I know most people usually flew in on Sunday. But who schedules a meeting at 7 in the morning, for God's sakes?
In Vegas.
in Vegas, and of course I'm 5 minutes late and whatnot, and it's for Corsair. And we're like, can we still get into like the little presser? And they're like, yeah, come on in. They just started. And so they open the door, and I expect it to be like a large hall, like facing the direction I'm walking in. No, you walk in and you're literally like on stage right. And you have to then walk around the entire, press section to get to find a seat. And I walk in the door and I literally have to do this because I almost ran into the first chair, and I look down and Linus is sitting right there.
Nice.
And he does one of these. He goes, but literally that 10-second interaction of like me almost tripping over like, the tech tuber, in my brain, it wasn't like being starstruck. It was, wow, he's just a guy. He's just as irritated to be here at 7 a.m. as I am, and he just about had someone trip over him because someone was running late. And he's, he wants to get in, get out, get on with his day just like everyone else does.
Yeah, that's a really good outlet.
Literally that. That negative interaction with someone, and I know he probably doesn't remember that interaction, but that just kind of stuck with me because I walked to the back and I'm looking through the sea of people, and it's like, oh, there's Paul's Hardware, and there's Bitwit, and there's Jay, and there's this, and I'm just going down the line of like all the different YouTubers who were there at 7 a.m. and they're all just people.
Yeah, humanizes them a lot. That's a really good take on it too. I would have been like, oh man, but yeah, that's a really good take on it. Yeah, I don't get that a lot, but some people think like, oh, Tim, you know everything about everything. I'm like, no way. that is a dangerous path to go down to, just because some of my stuff is highly technical. But yeah, it's awesome that you were able to meet that and see, the human element, because that's I agree with that too. And yeah, and I again agree, or thank you for that tweet, because that gave me a ton of motivation. I was just like, okay, like, because you were just like, yep, we'll work these two ways, either's fine. And I was like, okay, I know what video I'm doing next, and yeah, it set me down a path.
Yeah, it's really funny because speaking of virtualization, everyone thinks that virtualization is some weird pixie dust that just, you're doing exactly what it says. You're virtualizing a PC. Virtualization should work in theory like bare metal. And now obviously there's a lot of caveats within that, but there's also a lot of advantages that you can do things inside virtualization that you can't do with native bare metal. But at its core, what you're trying to do is virtualize a bare metal PC with such and such specifications that you are providing to it. And there's 100 different ways to do that. But at the end of the day, the VM that you create really doesn't know the difference between running as a VM and running as native hardware. And once you get your mind around that concept, it makes things a heck of a lot easier to swallow.
Yeah, it certainly does. Yeah, it certainly does. So you mentioned a couple of things. You'd mentioned you do GPU pass-throughs. You mentioned a lot about TrueNAS, but you have your cloud computing, cloud gaming server.
The cloud gaming rig.
Yeah, that I've been following. I think you were like on episode 7 or something like that. I think the 7 or 8.
I think I passed that a while ago.
Oh,
I stopped numbering them at a certain point. I think I'm at like 12 or 13 different videos on the subject.
It's so awesome because I'm so interested in that too. Could you talk a little bit about like where that is currently at and some of the challenges you face? I think last challenge I saw was the double encode or double decode if you're using something, to remotely play.
So just to catch everyone up, when I say cloud gaming, what I mean is actually a self-hosted cloud gaming server. And this can be for you and your personal use, or it can be for, like I have virtual machine instances up and running for my niece and nephew. So they have just Chromebooks that their school gave them, but in their off time, they can now use Parsec or Moonlight and remote into gaming instances that I created for them and game as if they're sitting in front of a full-fledged gaming PC. My neighbor's kids have logged into the same thing. So they don't have PCs for themselves, and they only have like one Xbox. So the two boys can't can't play at the same time. But it's like, well, heck, I've got a couple extra little Chromebooks laying around here. Have a couple Chromebooks and log into this PC, and you and my kids can play Minecraft together. And so it's really a self-hosted distributed virtual desktop instance, VDI. You get a full fat desktop, you get a full fat GPU, and that was kind of the end goal. Getting there was a whole different conversation. So this project started off because one of my Discord members sent me a link to a Newegg listing. Newegg was clearancing off some old NVIDIA Tesla GPUs. They had some Tesla K10 cards, which were based off the Kepler architecture. So basically, they shared the same GK102 GPU as the GTX 680. So not necessarily the most performant GPU, but definitely up to snuff for, you know, some AAA games and whatnot, especially at the time when I started this 3.5, almost 4 years ago.
Yeah, for sure.
But they have 4 gigabytes of video memory per each GPU. Oh, by the way, there's 2 dies on this card. And I picked up 3 of these cards for $40 each.
Nice.
And I went, there has to be a way to game on these cards. And so down the rabbit hole I went. It started with, could you do direct pass-through? Well, there was no way to emulate a display on direct pass-through. The only thing that you could do with them is basically NVENC video encoding and CUDA. And you couldn't do DirectX. You couldn't do anything else. So I started reading up on what NVIDIA's virtual desktop interface software was, and that's a system called Grid. Grid, back in the Kepler days, was actually free. You bought the hardware and you could use Grid to virtualize your GPUs. They limited that to specific cards, though. Now, there's physically no difference between a Tesla K10 and the Grid card, which they called the Grid K2. Yep. They are physically identical cards, with the exception of 4 resistors that change the PCID of the card to recognize as a Grid compliant card or a Tesla card. So I did some very fine soldering and swapped out those resistors after a lot of research to figure out which ones, got them recognized as Grid cards, and then downloaded the proper software. The only system that I could get it running with was, I believe, VMware 6.5. So ESXi, and you also have to have vSphere installation and a whole bunch of other steps to walk through. Yeah. But in the end, I ended up getting 4 gaming desktops off of a single GPU.
That's awesome.
And since then, there's been a lot of movement in the community. Not to pat myself on the back, but I believe partially due to like me trying to demonstrate this system, where some people started taking the modern NVIDIA Grid system and applying it to consumer level cards. Yeah. And so it took the hardware limitation away, and it also took away part of the software limitation of NVIDIA's licensing. Now, that gets a little dicey because people go, oh, you're subverting licensing. Well, yes and no, because NVIDIA also licenses this service for free to Microsoft with various other cards. And so I don't really, it's a difficult line to draw, where it's like, on one hand, if you're using this in Proxmox, they require you to pay. But if you're using this in Microsoft, there's a free system with drivers available that are completely open that you can just apply. And I went, well, I'm basically doing the same thing, but I'm going to run it on my own thing. And transferring a license and the same reason that emulation is technically legal is you can take a license from one piece of hardware and run it on another piece of hardware regardless of what the license agreement says. And so I'm splitting hairs, but
because it works with Hyper-V, right? Like this technology works with Hyper-V, and so
with GPU-P, right? GPU para-virtualization inside of Hyper-V, which is a feature of Windows 11 and Server 2022. Yeah, and that was actually one of the reasons that NVIDIA unlocked GeForce virtualization pass-through, because that's always been a driver block as well, was to appease Microsoft and allow that system to work. So what looked like a gift to gamers was actually a repercussion of NVIDIA needing to unlock that for Microsoft to use inside of Hyper-V.
Yeah. Yeah, it's super interesting, and I was even inspired by you doing GPU pass through, because I was like, when I first started, well, I've been doing virtualization for a long time, but when I was first like exploring different hypervisors, Proxmox came up, obviously you came up a ton, and I was like, okay, Craft Computing's doing Proxmox. I might go Proxmox, but like I had a requirement. I'm like, can I pass through a GPU? And you had a video on passing through a GPU. I was like, this is perfect, because this is exactly what I need. And it's been great, but I haven't gone down the path of dividing up my GPU and sharing it across different guest machines. Can you actually divide it up? And like, if one of your guest machines is off, can it dynamically like allocate the rest of the card to it, or is it static?
That's the really cool part. So to answer that question, yes and no.
Okay.
So your RAM allocation is static. Your video memory can only be split and allocated to different VMs. And whether that VM is on or off, it is allocated to X VM. And so if I give, right now, my system is running an EPYC 7742 64-core processor with 128 PCI Express lanes and 250. It is far outgrown the original project. I also have 3 Titan X Pascals running with 12 gigs of VRAM each. Nice. So those 12 gig cards, what I can do is I can actually divide those into 4 3-gigabyte instances. And so that one server, it's a 4U server, is capable of running 12 virtual gaming PCs and pretty much matching 1080p low settings on just about any AAA game. And you can run, I have ran all 12 instances simultaneously.
Like at that point, so like you're like cloud gaming at scale, mini scale at home, but that's a pretty big scale. Like, what's your bottleneck there? Is the next bottleneck RAM, or is the next bottleneck SSD or hard drives, or
network upload?
Oh.
So I have Comcast internet. I have gigabit down, but I pay extra to get 50 megs up.
Oh,
a 1080p stream, you can do 1080p at between 6 and 10 megs. And so remotely, I can get, anywhere between 5 and 8 good 1080p streams up, depending on how intense they are. And because the Pascal cards have 4 NVENC encoders on them, I can encode all 4 streams with MPEG-4, and they're pretty good quality. Awesome. The problem is, going beyond 8, I don't have enough upload bandwidth to make that work.
Yeah. So what if you were on a LAN, and like what if you're on a LAN? What's the next bottleneck?
The next bottleneck, storage latency.
Okay.
Because now I'm not asking one NVMe drive to load assets for 1 or 2 game instances. I'm asking a RAID or an array of drives to load up game assets for 12 clients, all using random IO.
Wow. Yeah.
So think about the random IO test when you get down there on Crystal Disk Mark.
Yeah.
What's that bottom number? Yeah. That's the number that counts.
That's tough, because you wouldn't normally think like, oh, well, I'm going to build this gaming machine, and then all of a sudden your bottleneck is SSDs. It's like, man, it doesn't get faster than that, or unless you throw more in an array, or.
Exactly. And so what I wound up doing was I have 10 1.2 terabyte SATA SSDs running in, I believe my last configuration was it a RAID 10? I think it was a RAID 10, essentially, to get enough random read speed out of these drives, and there were 2 local copies of the data with essentially 5 drives each that they could just scan and pull from.
Yeah.
And that did an all right job. It wasn't great, but it was all right. Honestly, the next thing is probably going to be running Intel Optane DIMMs as my read cache for this whole setup.
Yeah, that's the next place I was going. Like, if you could cache this somewhere, then you know. So you mentioned Intel Optanes, and I know, let's talk about another big project you just had recently. You threw a terabyte of RAM. into a 45 drive system. Yeah. Another feat of engineering.
That was fun.
Yeah.
That was just so much fun. So yeah, 45 drives was very, very generous and sent me over one of their AV15 Storinators, which is a 15 bay 4U storage server. It had on board an Intel Xeon 4218 Silver CPU, which is 8 cores, 16 threads, perfectly capable for a file server. They gave me 128 gigs of RAM and 7 20 terabyte Seagate Exos drives.
Nice.
Fantastic server, runs like a top. It is everything that I've ever wanted in a storage server. And obviously being a home labber, I've never been able to afford new either. And so getting an opportunity to work with someone like 45 drives has just been fantastic. But of course, me being me, I couldn't leave well enough alone.
Yeah, you had to craft it a little bit, didn't you? Craft and mold it into, the Craftinator, right?
It's called the Craftinator now.
Right.
So I found a QS sample of an Intel Xeon 5218, which is double the threads and cores, 16 core, 32 thread.
The gold one, right? Wasn't it a gold?
Yeah, it's a Xeon Gold, 2nd gen scalable.
Yeah.
So Cascade Lake. And it has the ability to use Optane DIMMs or NVDIMMs, which are persistent memory DIMM slots. They're not as fast as a standard DRAM DIMM, your DDR4 2666, which are capable of, 20 gigabytes per second per DIMM or something like that, divided across your 6 memory channels. But they are using 3D X-Point as far as the memory goes. So it's the same chips that came on the 16 and 32 gigabyte Optane drives that you would put in. And they are insanely fast for random IO read and write. They are some of the most endurant NAND flash chips that you can get, in the order of thousands of petabytes total write endurance.
Wow.
Versus some drives that you buy off the shelf today are 400 terabytes written, and that's about all you get.
Yeah.
These are in the thousands of petabytes written as far as endurance ratings go.
Wow. So robust.
So I put a terabyte in there.
Yeah.
As one does.
Yeah. I was thinking, like, what could I do with a terabyte of RAM? Like, I have a hard time I have half a terabyte between my 2 servers, but
yeah,
RAM's not the first thing I run out of in servers anymore. It's usually disk space. But yeah, so talk about that, like a terabyte of RAM.
A terabyte of RAM.
What do you do with it?
What do you do with it? That's the cool thing with Optane DIMMs is you can do 2 different modes of operation. One is you can use it just as traditional memory. You can use it like DRAM, and your system won't know any difference. So you do deal with some latency and overall bandwidth issues because it is not as fast or as latency free as standard DRAM would be, but it also costs about 1/4 for the capacity that DDR4 DRAM would be.
Yeah.
And so I picked up 1 terabyte of Optane DIMMs for literally $1,000.
Wow.
For the same project, I spent $1,600 on 384 gigs of DDR4.
Ooh, yeah,
to like give you a price. Like the 1 terabyte of RAM was not the most expensive part of this system by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah.
But it allows you to literally the server could run 4 terabytes of Optane memory right now as system memory. And if you've got like a 4 terabyte SQL database or multiple databases that you need to hold in cache and have them be, readily accessible and nearly as fast as DRAM, that's your solution.
Yeah, because I use Redis a lot, and Redis is a big in-memory database, basically.
Yeah.
Big key value store, and people scale like massively. But if Redis ever goes down, it's all in memory, so it goes away. So this sounds like a cheap solution compared to DRAM.
Yeah. The second mode of operation is a little bit more complex, and it's called app direct mode. And you basically have to build in support to the applications that you want to run to be able to recognize the Optane memory. But essentially, your system presents 2 memory options to to your system, where normally you just have, okay, how much RAM do I have? Well, now it's how much RAM and how much Optane flash do I have? It's presenting both of those as memory options, and your applications have to be built to recognize both pools. It is definitely much more complicated.
Sounds like it.
However, also in AppDirect mode, there is a method of essentially creating storage volumes and attaching them directly to virtual machines.
Wow.
and basically using this Optane drive as persistent memory inside of a VM.
Wow.
Or as cache for a VM, and so while it's not as fast as DRAM, it leaves NVMe in the dust as far as most of the most important metrics go.
Yeah.
Like the random IO tests that I was mentioning, NVMe's, even some of the top end NVMe's, you might run into like 80 megabytes random 4K reads, for example. This did, I think it was 1600 megabytes per second random IO.
Yeah. Wow. That's insane. So you could boot Windows in like 2 seconds.
Oh, yeah.
You don't even get to see anything. You see, the UEFI screen, and all of a sudden it's like login.
Yeah, and you're at your desktop and ready. Yeah. So some upcoming projects I'm going to do is actually like, what can you do with this fast of latency storage? And when I say fast, it's not necessarily overall bandwidth, because these still peak out at about NVMe Gen 3x4, that 3000 megahertz or megabyte per second cap or so. But you don't suffer from the latency hit. And so you're still, even at the most latency that it's going to see, you're still at 1500 megabytes per second.
Wow.
So
yeah,
it's pretty insane.
Yeah, that's definitely pretty incredible. Before we go on, what are you drinking? I think a few people in chat have asked, what are you drinking? And we need to know.
Yes. So this is an Ex Novo beer. This is a local Portland company. They have two different breweries. There's one in Portland, and then there's another in New Mexico. And they both brew different varieties and then distribute them all over the West Coast. But they are pretty fantastic. I really have never had a bad beer from Ex Novo. So if you see it on the shelf, just grab it. You'll be happy. This one is the No Shade Here. It's a fruited wheat beer. It has raspberry and lemon in what is essentially like a traditional German, wheat ale.
Yeah.
It's 5.5%. It is a phenomenal summer beer.
Yeah, I was going to say, sounds summery. Lemon and raspberry.
Yeah, it's very much like a raspberry lemonade with a little bit of that, a little bit of German barley and malt flavor to it.
Yeah,
fantastic.
sounds pretty good. So terabyte of RAM in a server, 12 gamers on a PC, or one gaming server. What are some other like incredible things you've done? I mean, I know you've done a ton of networking. I've seen like your NAS storage solution in a 1U with like 12 drives in there. Like it's like you keep one-upping yourself all the time. But what are some other like memorable things that you've done that you'd point back to and say, yeah, that was pretty awesome?
Boy, I mean, those are definitely the two like the crowning achievements, like either I brought attention to it or I did that. And those are definitely things that I like to hang my hat on. One thing that has always been successful on my channel that I've was an annual thing for a couple of years, and then I skipped a couple of years because Valve did too. SteamOS.
Yeah.
So I've always been very interested in Linux as a gaming platform. And as we all know, SteamOS actually debuted all the way back in 2012.
I remember.
This is a 10-year-old project at this point. And one of the first videos I did on my channel, I think it's like one of the first 10 or 15 videos that I did, was what is SteamOS and why was Valve doing this? And essentially it was harken back to 2012. Windows 8 was coming out. What was Windows 8 trying to do? Force everyone into a walled garden with the Microsoft Store and whatnot. This was Valve's retaliation saying, we don't need you. We can take our games and go somewhere else.
Yeah.
And so regardless of how successful the original SteamOS was, make no mistake, it was a shot across the bow of Microsoft.
Yeah.
And Microsoft responded by saying, okay, Steam, you can come in and have, an unsanctioned app, and we're not going to fight. That was a major like head-to-head thing that Microsoft blinked first.
I bet because it's a gaming platform. I mean, it still is.
Yeah.
It's an everything platform, productivity, whatever you want it to be. But gaming is a huge part of Windows. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. There's a lot of jokes from technologies past about why did we adopt Blu-ray, or why did we adopt VHS? And it's because, well, the adult film industry adopted those as their standards. And that's what we all use now, because it wasn't VHS versus Betamax; it was Betamax versus porn, and this is actually a very similar argument to that, where if the gamers weren't on Windows or had an alternative to Windows, would everything stay on Windows? And the answer is no.
Yeah.
Gaming actually has a huge foothold in why Windows remains popular and remains as prevalent as it is. Now, fast forward a couple of years to 2018, and all of a sudden we've got Valve with Steam Play and Proton, which is their wine package, which basically rolls everything up into a nice, tidy little installation that gets DirectX to Vulkan compatibility and DirectX 12 translations and OpenGL, simplifications for cross-platform. And all of a sudden, something like 60% of your Windows games are now playable on Linux with just a couple of clicks.
Yeah.
And
it's a tough, it used to be tough going through, the Steam store and looking for games that were compatible with Linux. But like, as you mentioned, Proton, if they're putting in shims to make it just run on Windows with Wine or Linux with Wine, that's pretty awesome.
Right. And so in 2018, that's when Valve implemented Proton, and man, what a game changer that has been as far as compatibility goes, and just out of the box playability of Linux as a gaming platform. But I will say one of the crowning achievements that I like to put my hat on was in March 2018, when I wrote that first SteamOS video. Valve hadn't touched SteamOS for a couple of years. They hadn't updated their pages. They still had Steam machines for sale on the Valve store. When I posted that video, within 5 days, all the links were gone. Valve had pulled so I don't know if the right person saw that video, but that video got very popular very quickly. It was one of my first really big hits.
Yeah.
I think for a while it had hit 500,000 views or something like that. Like,
wow.
it got some pretty good traction.
Wow.
For someone who only had, 20,000 subscribers.
Yeah.
When I wrote that first one.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. Steam. Yeah, it's interesting because even Apple kind of pulled this on Steam too. So I have a Mac for work, and I had Steam on there, and it's great. There were a lot of cross play games or cross compatible games. Then all of a sudden, Apple introduced this this feature where they were disabling all 32-bit apps. Which, right? This feature where they're disabling all 32-bit apps, and that totally turned my Steam on Mac to nothing at all. Because I was playing games from 10 years ago. There's no way developers are going to go back and release a 64-bit version of this game. So I basically killed Steam on a Mac OS.
Right. What's going to be really interesting is to see, because Proton is open source, and so is Wine, to see if someone with the right amount of time and leverage starts paying attention to the Apple ARM platform and starts leveraging Proton over on that, because it doesn't have to run 32-bit natively, because you're just translating your layers.
Yeah.
And so there may be ways to get Proton and Wine up and running inside of Mac OS the same way that it's running inside of Linux today. So that's going to be something to keep an eye on, I think, for the next frontier. Now, why is Linux getting all the attention first? Well, because it's completely open source.
Yeah.
However, make no mistake, Mac with their 6, 7, 8% market share, I believe they're going to be a target of Valve here as well, especially when it comes to mobile, when it comes to iOS and the domination that they have in that platform. But just as a fun little aside for the SteamOS video as well, in the second one that I did, have you ever pissed off a community so thoroughly that they go back and retroactively change Wikipedia entries?
No, I hope not. Well, maybe. I don't.
um, so, how do you explain wine to someone who knows nothing about translation or compatibility or, well, the most common thing is an emulator. We know what emulators are.
Yep.
I've been emulating games since the mid 90s.
Yep.
Like, we know what an emulator is. Now there's low level emulation and there's high level emulation. Low level emulation is typically what we think of because that is hardware level, instruction level emulation. That is taking the original zeros and ones and where they're supposed to go in the original SNES or Sega hardware and translating it to the modern equivalent to run as if it were running on native hardware. Well, there's also high-level emulation, which is essentially instruction translation, where you're translating the instruction from a native set over to something like DirectX or OpenGL or Vulkan. When I explained wine, I went, I don't want to get into a 20-minute explanation of wine because this is only a 20-minute video. And so I'm just going to say wine is an emulator of sorts. And I was very specific in that word choice.
Yeah.
And I knew it would be contentious when I said it, but it's like, how do you explain something so quickly just so everyone gets on the same page and then move on? And you have to use the right words. And those were the words that I chose to convey that message. Just because wine says wine is not an emulator does not mean wine is not an emulator.
Yeah.
Like,
that's right.
Right. And so wine, believe it or not, is still a form of emulation. Translation layer and compatibility layer are forms of high-level emulation. Now, the reason I say that is because on the Wikipedia page, when I posted this video, wine said it emulates the POSIX layers inside of the Linux kernel to make, or inside of the Windows kernel to make them compatible with native Linux instructions. Mm-hmm. Now it says wine is a compatibility layer to allow native Windows code to run inside of Linux. Also, when you go to the term compatibility layer and look it up in software, that also used the term emulation to explain how it actually worked. They went back after I posted that video and changed that language as well.
Oh man, yeah, man. So you're influencing them to change Wikipedia pages. So so you're talking about SteamOS. I know that you recently released a video too on basically installing Steam on a PC again. So what's that all about?
Going full circle.
That's right.
Yeah. So there is a project out there called Hollow ISO. It's over on GitHub. It is essentially an open source implementation of what Valve is doing with SteamOS. SteamOS used to be based on the Debian kernel and was basically an offshoot of far removed offshoot of Debian. They decided to go with Arch as it is a much more up-to-date collection of packages and can do live updates a lot easier than other distros can. And so Valve made the transition to Arch and then released the SteamOS 3.0. I'm still going to call it an alpha because it really only runs on the Steam Deck because it's meant to run on that hardware. But because it just runs on Arch and it relies on completely open source packages, and you can tell Steam that you still want to load the Deck UI regardless of the device that you want. There's been a team out there that has basically taken all of Valve's packages, repackaged them, and made a generic installer for it. And so I gave it a try on the desktop, and I really like it. Now, off camera, I've also been experimenting with some different installations and distros of Linux to see, is it SteamOS that I like, or is it the backend work that I've really been enjoying? Is it Proton and Steam Play and the ease of use as far as all that goes? And I'm kind of coming to the conclusion that, man, Proton and Steam Play are just insanely powerful. And it's the implementation that I like, not necessarily SteamOS as a whole. SteamOS is great for a console-like experience because it boots straight into a very familiar GUI. You can navigate everything through controls. For a desktop OS, it's not great because keyboard, mouse,
Yeah.
But I've been playing around with Pop! OS lately and installed Proton, got it up and running. By the way, also, I challenged myself to never once open the terminal because I think as a consumer, that's what people expect. They expect point, click, and then play game.
For sure.
And so I went, sure, yeah, I can do that in Linux, same way I can open the command line in Windows, but the average consumer is not going to do that. And so to be a consumer-friendly OS, you have to be point, click, and very, very simple. I have been loving Pop! OS as far as the Linux install and having Steam Play enabled on there. The overall experience has been fantastic. I have a native desktop. I've got all the applications that I could ever want. And every single game that I've tried to play in Steam has worked so far.
Nice.
And so while I'm really excited about Steam OS when it comes to like the handheld market, that is still kind of niche. Now, it may grow because of the popularity of the Steam Deck and the price barrier coming down because of these custom AMD chips that are coming out from, Aya Neo and GPD and all these other companies. But what's really cool is the core of what makes all that work, and that is Proton, and that is Valve in the background.
Yeah, for sure. Like I've been a huge fan for a long time too. I've streamed games. I still have a little stream device. I forget what it's called because I never even have to think about what it's called. But I still have one hooked up to my TV. I stream games from my PC all the time down to Comfy Couch. Which is where, Steam is usually relied on. I mean, before, the Deck, Steam Deck and other devices, they've always relied on, a PC, a mouse and keyboard or just a computer in general. But streaming it to your TV with Comfy Couch and controller is fantastic too. I've noticed the catalog too for their controller-based games has just exploded, which I'm excited about because I can play most games here, on my keyboard and mouse, but every now and then, it's great to play controller-based games. You can stream them to any device too now, which is fantastic. And the tech is so awesome. Like, how do you get milliseconds of latency to play these games? Like some really Twitch-based games, platformers where I feel like I'm almost playing at my desktop. It's incredible.
Yeah. No. Now there's been a couple of things that have really helped with the latency through the development, and actually, you can go all the way back to Palmer Luckey with Oculus and what's his name? The ID founder, ID Games, the Doom Carmack.
Yeah,
Carmack. When they were originally working on the Oculus project, trying to get panel latency down as low as they could, because you didn't want ghosting on the panel and you didn't want to turn your head and then it follow you on Tuesday. Right. And so one of the things that they really strove to was decrease controller and panel latency for VR headsets. Well, fast forward 10 years, that has actually translated into a lot of TVs and monitors coming way down in latency because of developments that Oculus made all that many years ago.
Interesting.
On the panel side, that's really made a difference. And then also on the Wi-Fi side of things, there's been a lot of new implementations with Wi-Fi 6, Wi-Fi 6E that have significantly lowered latency. As we've progressed. I mean, think back to 2012 and wireless N and what kind of latency we dealt with back then.
Which spec? Pre-wireless N or the second wireless N or the
We'll go with do you remember back when Apple sold Wi-Fi cards inside of like Mac Pros and MacBook Pros that were wireless N spec? Which was the pre-spec to wireless N.
I had a router.
When IEEE comes out, this should match most of it.
I had a router. It was a Netgear or Cisco. No, it was Cisco. Linksys Cisco at the time. And it was like pre-N. I was like, I'm all over that. I don't know. And,
100 megs a second. Heck yes.
It was blazing fast at the time. It was. N went through a lot of weird stuff. Like I feel like the cart was before the horse on that. The spec wasn't done, but they were selling devices that were pre-N.
It
Yeah, good time. So speaking of networking, I know you do a ton of networking stuff too. You do a lot of 10 gig and more stuff. Like, what's your current topology? I think that's how another video how I found you too. You found a great solution for 10 gig. I know a lot of people are excited about 10 gig networking. What are some throughput speeds and how do you use them? You know?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great subject. So my current topology is, again, I've got a Comcast internet. So by the way, if you have Comcast or Cox or whoever you might have for an internet service provider, buy your own modem. I know Comcast says you can't. You can. Yeah. They legally have to let you buy your own modem. Yeah. You can either spend $12 a month for whatever garbage they give you for the fastest in-home Wi-Fi, which is one of the slowest routers I've ever used in my natural life, or just buy your own modem and use your own solution.
Yeah, I always purchased mine. I remember the first one was like that Linksys one you could stack on top of the other Linksys models, like the WRT.
Oh yeah, the WRTs.
Yeah, and I bought the modem, and I was just like, people are like, "You have your own modem?" I'm like, "Yeah, it's like $50. This thing will be paid off in about 4 months."
Yeah. Exactly. So yeah, I've got my gig internet coming in, and that goes into a Unify USG Unify Dream Machine. So the Dream Machine Pro rack mountable runs the Unify controller. I've got 10 gig routing capabilities on that. I pretty much only use that as a Unify controller and a router. It doesn't handle any backbone traffic.
Yeah, real quick, did you know that Unify now unlocked that 10 gig SPF plus WAN to be reassigned to LAN?
Yes.
Yes, blew my mind.
See that.
I made a video and I was like, man, I wish they'd do that. And there was like 1,000 comments where they're like, they just did it. I was like, oh, that's awesome. Anyways.
Nice. Yeah. No, I literally saw that like a week ago, and I was like, oh yes. So I've got my 1 gig coming into the WAN port, and then I've got the SFP plus just going out to a distribution switch. Now, most people, if they're going Unify, would probably go with the XG16, which is a fantastic option from Unify for a distro switch, 16 10 gig SFP plus ports, plus a management port on it. I went with a Microtech CRS 342, 360. I don't remember the model number offhand, but it's a 24 port 10 gig distribution switch using SFP plus, runs either router OS or switcher OS, which are Microtech's two variants of their infrastructure. And it is not great for layer 3, but inside of a home lab, who is running layer 3 outside of experimentation. Pretty much every network I've ever come across, especially in home, we're all running layer 2. Like, don't kid yourselves.
So layer 3, like, explain real quick. That's DHCP, or explain.
Right. So layer 2 versus layer 3. Layer 2 is what I'm going to try to use layman terms here.
Go ahead. I'm not a networking expert.
Yeah. So. Layer 2 is a flat network. Layer 2 is you assign IP addresses to essentially every port and every VLAN main address, and everything can talk to everything. When you have layer 3, it's more instruction and routing based. And so it gets a lot more complicated. You don't necessarily have IP addresses that are assigned directly to interface ports. You have routes and if or then statements that can say, like, you can do something like plug your cable modem into your switch and then pass that same port through to another port on your switch, and then pass that down to a router, and then have your switch be your distro for that. And if your router fails, you can go, oh, my router failed, I'm going to just dynamically assign it to another port.
I see.
And so it's a lot more rules based and a lot more complex. You'll see layer 3 in business routing. You'll see it in geographic topology and whatnot. For a home network and for pretty much every business network, just go layer 2. Like keep it simple. Layer 3 also requires so much as far as processing horsepower goes. And a lot of the processing horsepower is actually specific hardware instructions. And so you have to have the right hardware, not just brute force with, CPU horsepower. So the MikroTik, when you're running layer 2, it can run line rate. And when I say that, it can run 10 gig on every port, and every port can run at the same time, full up, full down, you'll get full speed.
So the backplane can handle all of that traffic.
The backplane can handle 240 gigabit of traffic.
Wow.
And so, yeah, you're going to be fine. If you run layer 3, you can pretty much cut that down to like 200 megabit per port. When you're trying to do layer 3 routing traffic. So it is not great for a business distribution switch or a top of rack, data center switch. But for the home user and for like small medium business distribution, it is fantastic. And it's like $340. Yeah. It's not expensive.
Yeah. It's a good price.
Right. And so that is my top of rack switch. That is where all of my 10 gig comes in and out to. I've got 10 gig directly from that to all of my individual servers, sometimes on multiple ports, just for redundancy or different throughputs, or, one network talking to another network.
And do you use, is it fiber? Are you doing DAC or a mix of both, or RJ45?
I'm doing primarily, now SFP Plus is pretty much always going to be cheaper than RJ45. And DAC is always cheaper than fiber. So for those not in the know, there are basically 3 cable options when it comes, or technically 4, but that's because fiber gets weird. Technically 3 cable options when it comes to 10 gig connectivity when you're talking networking. There is RJ45, which we all know and love. That is Cat 6 and Cat 6A. And you have to have RJ45 plugs on both ends. You have to run a Cat 6 or Cat 6A cable. You run into issues because 10 gig doesn't like running over copper that well. And there are some serious limitations when it comes to bandwidth and overall throughput of the cable itself. You're starting to bend physics in ways that it doesn't like to be bent. And to get a Cat 6A cable that is 10 gig certified up to 50 meters, your twisted pairs have to maintain the twist up to 4 millimeters within each plug. I believe is the official spec. And that includes your RJ45 jacks that you're plugging into. You have to have 4 millimeters of untwisted cable, and that's how you have to maintain it. Otherwise you will lose the consistency of the signal.
Is that why they have like the extra shielding, or the sheath in the middle or something?
The shielding is also part of that spec, because the cables have to be isolated from each other and also have to be isolated from external interference. And even then, even with some shielded Cat 6A cable, if you run that near like a fluorescent light ballast, you can actually down negotiate your cable connection from 10 gig to 1 gig.
Wow.
So yeah, 10 gig does not like to run over copper, let alone for long distances.
Okay.
So RJ45, it's also very expensive when you're running 10 gig. The next 2 options are native SFP Plus port connections, which is just a square open hole. And that actually has some logic in the cable itself, kind of like the old Thunderbolt cables did. And so there is a DAC cable, or a direct attached copper cable. That is an SFP module with a cable that's hardwired into it, into an SFP module on the other side. That is the cheapest and most efficient way to do it. However, those have a 15-meter limit for the most part. I've seen some 30 meters, and you could do those in some circumstances. But as far as a single rack or a single row of racks, DAC is the way that you want to go. You can spend anywhere from about $10 to $40 on a cable, and you will get 10 gig, and it's pretty much guaranteed. So that is what I recommend there. Now, when it gets to fiber, that's when you have to have lengths longer than 15 to 30 meters. So with fiber, there's 2 modes of fiber. There is what's called multi-mode fiber and single mode fiber. Single mode fiber is what's used in most industry, and it is what's used for long distances. You can stretch single mode fiber for miles, so long as you have the right transmitter and receiver on each end. And then you can also repeat that very, very simply with like little transceiver boxes that just send the signal further.
Yeah.
Most fiber that you see hung from telephone poles and whatnot is going to be single mode fiber.
I think that's what I have coming to my house from my ISP. I think it is.
Yep. Single mode is also significantly more expensive than multi-mode fiber. So what I run in my house is actually multi-mode fiber. And the GBICs, or the interfaces for the SFP Plus, are very inexpensive. They're somewhere at around $10 per module. You install those into your switch. Make sure that the firmware on the GBIC matches the switch that you're plugging it into. Switches like Microtech and Unify will take pretty much any manufacturer's GBICs. However, if you're going, old school home lab and buying, retired Cisco or Meraki or Intel gear or something like that, you're going to need to get a GBIC that matches the manufacturer of the switch that you have.
So that's why sometimes I see, like, when they list these GBICs, they're like compatible with these, 10 devices.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
And so, so like Unify and Microtech, like I said, they'll work with pretty much anyone. But if you have, let's say, an old HP ProCurve switch, sometimes you'll need an HP compatible GBIC for that. Sometimes even if you buy an HP compatible GBIC, it won't be compatible with an HP ProCurve because it's HP Aruba or it's HPE or it's this or it's that. So yeah, there's a lot of really weird variances that go along with SFP Plus. But yeah, for the average home network, DAC is the way to go.
Yeah, I'm experimenting. So I have a switch. I just got it. It's a 48 PoE switch. Don't mind the light mode in here. If you've been noticing the lights changing, it's because people on Twitch can change the lights in my room with channel points. It's all nerdy stuff that I wrote a lot of code for. So if they're changing, and anytime I mention changing the lights, then there's a light war. So there's probably a light war. Yeah, there's a light war. But I have a 48 port PoE switch. I primarily got it for that. But it has 4 SFP Plus ports on it. But I only have Cat 5e in my house. I'm going to give it a shot, though. I don't know how this is going to turn out. Probably very bad, but I'm going to do it for science. But that's kind of what I went down the path. How we learn. Yeah, that's right. Because I have an old house. We have, like, I can't run fiber easily. I don't want to climb back up in the attic again. I probably will if this doesn't work out great. But I thought, you know what? Why not give Cat 5e a chance, and we'll see how it goes. But I don't think it's going to go well. But a lot of people mention, with these RJ45 to SFP Plus GBICs, I guess they're called. I don't know if those are called GBICs.
GBIC or module or transceiver, they're all kind of interchangeable. GBIC is, I believe, the spec of the port itself, and so GBIC module is, I think, the most accurate.
All right, that's what I used to hear the networking admin say a long time ago. So
GBIC.
Yeah. I was like, oh, that sounds awesome.
That's what we always call them.
Cool. So, but I hear a lot of people say that those get really hot for RJ45. Have you ever run into anything like that, or like? I guess I don't know much about networking. I act like I do sometimes, but like RJ45, everyone says if you go SFP Plus to RJ45, it's going to give off a ton of heat, both on the cards and the GBIC. Have you ever run into anything like that, or?
I'll be honest, I've not run a lot of RJ45 GBICs because, well, RJ45 10 gig doesn't make a lot of sense for most people, and in most deployments. My server has a 10 gig RJ45, I'll just buy an RJ45 GBIC for $90, or an SFP Plus card that I can connect a DAC to for like $20.
Yeah.
There are more cost-effective ways to do this.
Yeah, I know. Tell me about it.
I do have a couple RJ45 GBICs. What I can tell you is, they do get hot, but like most things, they get hot within spec as long as you're installing them into the proper environments. Switches and 10 gig gear are not meant to be run in 95-degree garages with no airflow. Like you need proper airflow. But as long as you have those things, sure, server gear runs loud and hot, but it's kind of designed to run that way. That's why 1U servers sound the way they do, is because those 40 mil blowers on them are blowing at 20,000 RPM. That's what those are designed to do.
Yeah, they're usually running in a room where no one's listening.
Right, exactly.
Where noise, they don't mind noise. Yeah, so I don't know. I'm gonna give it a shot, mainly because I have my PC up here. Obviously do video editing. Sometimes it'd be nice to have 10 gig. I don't know if I'll edit over the network. I always hear like back and forth. Like I don't know. I do local proxies.
I edit over the network.
All right.
It's amazing.
All right. I've been doing local proxies. This is kind of insider talk for video editing, but
I edit here. Let me put it this way. I edit ProRes 422 LT over the network.
Wow, that's because it's a huge file size. I just learned about ProRes 444 yesterday while fixing all of that you see above me, and I rendered that in ProRes 444 because I needed alpha plus transparency. I don't know.
Okay, yeah.
But yeah, they're a huge file. I mean, huge. I mean, the thing was like 10 seconds long, and it's like 900 megabytes or something.
Yeah, no, that's not outside what. So like I said, I'm on 422 LT, which is pretty much the highest 8-bit encoding that you can get. It's not raw. There is some compression. It's like a 4:1 compression, but it is somewhere in the neighborhood of 100. It's like 10 gigs per minute, if not a little bit more. I think it's closer to like 12 gigs per minute.
Yeah.
And so if you've got an hour of raw footage,
yeah, you might as well do it overnight or something. That's
right.
Yeah.
But I edit that over a 10 gig network directly off my NAS.
Yeah, and no stuttering or anything, like
no stuttering, no hiccups. Yeah.
And true NAS with cache, I assume, or
true NAS, no cache. I don't even have an L2 ARC. Yeah, it's just straight up SMB.
And then that's okay. So SMB, Windows Share, and then fiber back to your fiber line, then back to
yes. Yeah. Let's back to topology.
Oh yeah. Terminate. Where does it terminate?
Yeah. So we started talking fiber. The reason I started talking fiber is I do have I think 2 of my servers are running on fiber simply because I didn't have the GBICs or the DACs on hand. So I just hey, I've got some old fiber cables. I'll throw them in. But from my garage to my studio downstairs here, which is in a daylight basement, it's like a 40-meter run.
Wow.
And so I was well outside what I could realistically do on copper. So I decided to run fiber. And so I bought a 50-meter run of multi-mode fiber, and then strung it up along the house and, punched into the garage and then punched into the downstairs. That actually terminates down into another MikroTik switch, a CRS 312 or something like that. It's a 24-port non-PoE gigabit switch, but then it has 2 SFP plus ports.
Nice.
And so I've got SFP plus coming in for the fiber from the garage, and then I've got a DAC cable from the other port going into my desktop.
Gotcha.
And so that also acts as a distribution switch for here in my office. So I have 1 gig going everywhere else.
Cool. Yeah. Nice.
And so that works great.
So not point to point. You always go back into your switch because you have the SFP plus ports, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. And so everything downstairs here in my office goes gigabit directly to that switch. And then I've got a 10 gig backhaul back to my garage.
Enterprise there. Yeah. That's pretty awesome. Speaking of your garage, like another interesting thing I saw you do a while ago was the air conditioner in your server rack. And I'm totally fascinated by that. I think a lot of people who have server racks are fascinated by that. 1, because they give out so much heat, and 2, they live in a home where they're not expecting this much heat to be dumped.
Right.
Could you talk about that a little bit?
So like all home labbers who go a little bit overboard with buying a full rack worth of used enterprise gear, it gets a little loud and you don't necessarily want it to live inside a broom closet or something like that. So the logical place is to put it out in your garage where no one lives and it's pretty sound isolated, right? The problem is in the summer, your garage is also one of the poorest insulated rooms of your house, and pretty much outside. So in the summer months, it's not unrealistic for my garage to hit 90, 95 degrees. That's even with it being 5 feet below grade. It's a sunken garage, dug into the back of a hillside. So I had to get the heat out somehow, but I also had to feed my servers cool enough air where they could continue running. From experience, I can tell you, even though hard drives say they have an operating temperature up to about 60 degrees Celsius, you will start to see significant hard drive failures if you run them in an ambient temperature of 35 C or higher, or about 95 degrees. And so that is usually my breaking point of like, now it is significantly cheaper to buy air conditioning than it is to continue replacing hard drives. Like that 35C is your breaking point. As long as you can keep it like 28 or lower, you're going to be golden. And so the goal of my air conditioning unit in my rack was not to maintain, the traditional server room, 63 degrees and 40%, humidity. It was to survive. And I will say last summer, we had the hottest summer on record here in Oregon. We set a record here in Salem at 121 degrees.
Wow, yeah.
Like we were like Death Valley levels.
Yeah, it was drought too, and
now my rack air conditioner is a 7K RM from Triplite. It's a 7,000 BTU, and it's capable of displacing about 800 watts of heat. And my server rack runs idle at right around 800 watts. So as long as I'm not like, running a long encode or something like that, 800 watts is pretty reasonable. And that's the amount of heat that unit displaces. It does require an enclosed rack because you're basically creating a plenum space where your rack is now an air conditioned unit. And then you need to pipe the heat outside the house. So I have some ducting that and then an additional blower fan, which also takes all that hot air and forces it outside the house. With that setup, I'm able to get about almost an 18-degree Fahrenheit delta between the ambient garage air and the air that's being forced into my servers.
Nice.
And so if it's 95 degrees inside my garage, my servers are being fed 77-degree air, which is like perfect.
Yeah. Even Google's, raised their data center, temperature specs because they weren't efficient enough, and they were like, it can be 80 in there now. So
exactly. And so I have my air conditioner set for 75, and so really, unless it's really, really hot in my garage, it doesn't kick on all that much. But you don't want to just place a window air conditioning unit at the bottom of your rack. Number one, that's going to just recirculate the hot air on the back end. And instead of displacing, 5,000 BTU of heat in the form of 600 watts, that 600 watts is also generating heat and recirculating it in the room. That's why you can't just put an air conditioner in the middle of your room and expect it to be cold.
Right.
You got to get the heat outside. So the 7KRM has a ducting unit that it doesn't just exhaust into the garage. It's actually piped outside the house. And like I said, you could realistically expect between 15 and 18 degrees of delta, as long as you set it up correctly.
It was incredible. Like I love that video. I remember it was like, I'm going to put an air conditioner in here. And I remember the Triplite one. And then I remember the challenges you had, like getting the piping up or the ventilation up, and then the elbow not working out right, or it's sticking out the back. And then I think, maybe it was in a part 2 when you put the fan in. I remember.
That was a 2-part install and testing video. So I ended up running, officially the Triplite asks for a 6-inch vent or a 6-inch duct, and you could run a 6-inch duct and have it be completely unassisted. My rack only had about 4 inches of room from behind the rack mounting rails to the rear door, and I wanted the rear door to close. I didn't want to, have to cut open the door or have a duct running up the wall or something like that, because that's just a pain. And so I wanted it to run internally in the rack, so I got a 6-to-4 reducer and then ran solid conduit 4-inch up to the top of the rack, and then exhausted it out the top. Then I used some flex tubing up to a 4-inch blower fan, which is capable of something like 180 cubic feet per minute or some crap like that. Now the blower fan actually runs incredibly quiet, and it's rated to run in ambient temperatures like 180 degrees. So feeding it 120-degree air is actually no problem at all.
Yeah, it's probably meant for an attic or something, where it's blazing hot.
Right, that's exactly what it's meant for, and it's an inline blower, so it has an inlet on one side and an outlet on the other, and just a giant impeller in the center, and that is enough to get the pressure high enough to actually exhaust all that hot air. Without that exhaust, it is a very inefficient system. It only drops my temps by like 4 or 5 degrees, and so running that in line makes the whole system work.
Yeah,
And like I said, you got to get the hot air out somehow.
yeah, that's awesome. I've been like noodling on how do I get my hot air out because I have a small room. They joke and we called it the grow room for a while because like when I moved
most
into
home labs start out looking like that,
right.
don't they?
Well, yeah, well, like it's a big long running joke because I had a fuse box that said sauna, but I don't know if there was ever a sauna there, so you can imagine. Yeah, that's right, in quotes. But I have my server rack in there, and my basement, it's an old Minnesota basement, so I don't have air conditioning down there, but I put it in the rest of the house. Anyways, long story short, somehow I need to get that warm air out, and I have just a vent about this big, but I'm not even sure if just blowing hot air out is going to help or if it's just going to pull it from somewhere else. I don't know.
Yeah, the one thing that people often don't think about when they are saying, oh, I need to get this hot air out, let me just add an exhaust fan or something like that, is the air has to come from somewhere. And if you're pulling 40, 50, 60 cubic feet per minute, that air has to be fed into that room too in order to keep the airflow going.
That's right.
And it's the same concept as running a fireplace, where if you run a fireplace in your living room, you will actually cool down other areas of the house because you'll start drawing air in from the outside. Yeah, your living room gets warmer, but your bedroom gets colder. And it's the same theory in server racks and network closets and things like that.
Yeah, create a vacuum. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You're creating a vacuum. You're pulling air in from the outside. And that's actually one of the drawbacks of my air conditioner inside of the garage now, is because I'm forcing 180 CFM outside the garage, that server rack is pulling 180 CFM into it, which means it's then pulling air in from the outside.
Oh, through the garage door or something like that?
Through the garage door, through cracks and everything else. And so I have noticed that my garage stays warmer longer than it did before, because it is no longer, warming up to 95 and then coming down with the rest of the temps. It is maintaining that high temperature for a longer period of time because it is drawing all that hot air in.
Wow.
So that is one drawback to the AC system, is you will make your garage hotter and it will stay hotter longer into the day.
Yeah, that's interesting stuff to think about. I need to figure it out at some point. I when I put my servers in the new place where they're at now, I thought, it was in the fall, and I was like, all right, I have until spring to figure it out. Well, it's summer now, and I still haven't figured it out. It's a box fan blowing cool air from upstairs to another box fan. It's just a series of fans to get air in there, but it's not too bad. I think I don't know, the ambient temperature in that room, I think the highest I've seen is 83. It's borderline kind of warm. But then again, my temperature sensor is at the top, the very top. So it's going to, it's going to be the warmest it could possibly be. Man, Jeff, I really appreciate you coming. I could probably talk to you all day. I know you got a lot to do, and I greatly appreciate you coming out. This has been a ton of fun. We've never really talked to. I mean, we like I said, we've had DMs. We've talked electronically, but I've never talked to you, and so I'm a huge fan. Huge fan. I've been for a while. Like I said, I referred to your videos when I was trying to build out my infrastructure, and I still do, and I enjoy all your videos. And just a huge thank you to helping me in the beginning, pointing me in the right direction.
No problem. And congratulations on your success as well. I mean, you have been absolutely killing it, for the last couple of years. So, I mean, I've really been enjoying your content as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it.
And that's no joke. So.
Yeah, I appreciate it. For everyone on the stream, thank you so much for tuning in and for doing something a little different. This is probably a lot better than me just blabbing the whole time. But I can't thank you enough. I know there were a lot of follows, subs, and bits, and I thank you so much. Sorry I didn't get to call them out. I also have realized now, too, that my bot is down, so my bot hasn't even been thanking you. I think the mods have been thanking people for it, too. So I appreciate it, and that's why. If you don't see me or the bot itself saying thank you for that, I do appreciate it. And like I mentioned, Jeff, you're absolutely welcome, but I know you got a lot going on. We usually hop in Discord voice here in about 5 minutes in a voice channel. A lot of people, where are they today? They pile into one channel and then we pile in Discord voice. Looks like they're in the Wasteland channel, so we're going to hop in there. But Jeff, thank you so much. Dude, this has been awesome. First time trying something different, and man, you made this great, so thank you.
No, great questions. I thought it was a really fun conversation. And I mean, yeah, shameless plug for myself. If you don't know who I am, I'm Jeff at Craft Computing. Follow me over there. Pretty much any website you can find me on, I'm at Craft Computing. If you like Techno Tim's content, you'll definitely like what I've got to offer as well. So
yeah, thank you so much. And thanks for reminding me about the plug. I'm new to this. All right. Hey, everyone on Twitch, I will see you absolutely next week. Might have something out this week on YouTube. As I hinted, I'm going to be playing with that switch back there, and I'm going to do some stuff for science over Cat 5e with 10 gig.
I actually can't wait to see that result, because sometimes it works. Like sometimes you get really good Cat 5e and it's like, ooh, they maintain those twists all the way. And then other times it's like, I bought a Cat 6 cable. Why can't I get 10 gig over a meter?
Oh, this is the bottom of the barrel stuff, so it's not going to go well. But if I get even more than 1 gig, it's a success. So
sweet.
All right. We'll see you all on Twitch. Thank you for tuning in, and be good to each other. Take care, folks.
Thank you.